Tonight, cracks in Washington's ironclad support for Israel. The once unanimous bipartisan support for the Jewish state now waning, even giving way to anti-Semitic comments from lawmakers.
This echoes of language that has been used to marginalize and persecute the Jewish people for centuries.
Plus, the challenge of our time.
Government of the people, by the people, for the people, can at times be fragile, but it also is inherently resilient.
The White House Virtual Summit for Democracy and remembering a World War II hero and a good American. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation.
Fighting anti-Semitism on Capitol Hill. Good evening and thanks for being with us. I'm John Jessup.
Welcome to Faith Nation. I'm Jenna Browder. Support for Israel. For decades, it's been something lawmakers on both sides of the aisle have been able to agree on. But now, some say the tides are turning, and a growing number of Democrats have started speaking out against Israel.
CBN Capitol Hill correspondent Abigail Robertson spoke with a member of the House Democratic Caucus about the trend and the very personal and public stand she's taking, pitting her against some members of her own party.
When Congresswoman Elaine Luria came to Washington in 2019, she never expected her first speech on the House floor would be standing up against anti-Semitic comments made by fellow Democrats. The first of many occasions she's defended Israel during her time in Congress.
I believe that I speak clearly for all fellow Jewish veterans that this echoes of language that has been used to marginalize and persecute the Jewish people for centuries.
Luria, a 20-year Navy veteran, tells CBN News she finds accusations of dual loyalty misplaced.
I find it shocking that other members of the House can perpetuate these tropes and things related to dual loyalty.
And adds she's surprised how often she's had to speak out against anti-Semitism.
I always viewed that the U.S. support for Israel was incredibly strong. Israel's our strongest ally in the Middle East, and that the U.S. Congress was a place where that support was unanimous. And have come to find that although it is broad and bipartisan, there are some very vocal voices that unfortunately continue to get louder that we have to make absolutely sure don't undermine that broad support that we have for Israel.
Luria believes some in her own party would prefer to say Israel doesn't have the right to exist.
They've said it clearly and publicly, and some of the rhetoric that has been used recently, referring to Israel as an apartheid state, and just different things that really overlook the unique situation of Israel, the unique security situation of Israel, and Israel's need to be able to defend itself. So I think that it is very concerning when elected members in our Congress, voice those types of opinions.
Recently, 8 Democrats and 1 Republican voted against providing $1 billion in funding to restock Israel's Iron Dome defense system after Hamas launched more than 4,000 rockets across the border last May.
It is concerning that there were a small number of members who felt that they couldn't support providing Israel with the resources to defend itself.
A few years ago, Luria sat down with Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib to voice concern about her anti-Israel rhetoric.
I was hopeful that moving forward, that she would change her tone, she and others, but unfortunately, that group has actually grown, both in numbers and in visibility.
Luria says as a Jewish congresswoman, she'll continue to fight anti-Semitism, and she hopes to help her colleagues understand the importance of U.S. support for Israel. Reporting from Capitol Hill, Abigail Robertson, CBN News.
All right, CBN Capitol Hill correspondent Abigail Robertson. Thank you, Abby. Joining us now, Chief Political Analyst David Brody. We've seen, David, disagreement spill out over infrastructure, but it's still relatively rare to see Democrats publicly air disputes like these. David, why do you think Congresswoman Luria decided to talk to CBN News about anti-Semitism within the Democratic caucus?
Well, this is personal to her. I mean, obviously a Jewish lawmaker, but it goes beyond that. Look, I grew up Jewish, and I have a bit of insight into all of this. Look, the Jewish people, especially Reform Jews, conservative Jews, we're really all Jews, but when you're more liberal, if you will, you look at the justice angle of everything. And of course, when it comes to the Jewish people being under persecution for, let me think, since the beginning of time, justice is a big deal. And so I think if you look at what the Congresswoman's track record has been, she's liberal on many issues, the justice prism is, I think, part of this. But look, I think ultimately this is about the Democrat Party moving so far left that she just had to speak up. And we're seeing more and more of those voices, which is a good thing, John and Jenna.
David, what's fueling the growth and influence of anti-Semitism among some of these Democrats?
Well, it's a good question. Look, it goes back years. I mean, I'm trying to go back. I think it was in the early 90s when the Progressive Caucus was formed. They had about 5 members back then. Yes, Bernie Sanders was a member, but it was like 4 other folks. And now it's up to over 95 in the Progressive Caucus of the Democrats. So, as we've moved through the last 20 to 30 years, we've seen the Democrats not only tilt to the left, which we've done stories on, but the actual ranks within Congress have grown as well, grown a lot more far left. And what's interesting here is that if you talk to Ilhan Omar or you talk to Rashida Tlaib, they're going to say they're not anti-Semitic at all. What they'll say is that they've got problems with the policy that Israel is spewing, if you will, especially under Benjamin Netanyahu. And so they try to make the delineation between their comments, who many call anti-Semitic, and what they believe is policies that they believe in essence, Israel are the oppressors here, which, of course, in and of itself sounds a bit anti-Semitic.
David, do you think the American people are buying it, or are they overplaying their hand here and taking it too far?
I think this is a problem for the Democrat Party, and I think they are overplaying their hand, Jen. I think it's a good question, and I think ultimately, look, Nancy Pelosi and some of the senior leadership within the Democrat ranks knows that as well. They understand that the American people are not this idea of being anti-Israel. That is not a good place for the Democrat Party to be. It doesn't help. I'm not going to suggest it's any sort of kitchen table issue, but it's a heart issue. It's an emotional issue. And I think that's something the Democrats don't want to be on the wrong side of.
David, just a few seconds left. We've seen anti-Semitism critics point out on both sides of the aisle. Her critics quick to point out Marjorie Taylor Greene, and even in QAnon conspiracies. Why is that, and does that jeopardize the gains that Republicans have been making with Jews?
Well, I'm glad you said her critics, because obviously some folks would say that those comments weren't anti-Semitic. But either way you take it, look, bottom line is this. It's human nature. And when I mean human nature, anti-Semitism doesn't discriminate as it relates, I guess pun intended, as it relates to Republicans and Democrats. This is not about a political party. Right. We know that Jews have been persecuted from the beginning of time, and that's not going away anytime soon.
All right. CBN News Chief Political Analyst David Brody, thank you as always.
Thanks, David.
You bet.
Well, to the White House, where President Biden is urging leaders around the world to lock arms and demonstrate democracy. Today, the president hosted the first ever Democracy Summit, gathering leaders from more than 100 democratic countries, urging them to stop the backward slide of citizens' rights.
In my view, this is the defining challenge of our time. Democracy, government of the people, by the people, for the people, can at times be fragile, but it also is inherently resilient.
During the two-day summit, President Biden is calling on his fellow leaders to collaborate on defending against authoritarianism, combating corruption, and promoting respect for human rights. Both Taiwan and Ukraine are among the attendees, but China and Russia noticeably not invited. Ahead of the summit, ambassadors from both countries wrote a joint editorial calling the gathering a product of a, quote, Cold War mentality that will create new dividing lines. President Biden said today that no democracy is perfect, but all can lock arms and commit to be better.
Well, here with us now is Robert Wilkie, former Secretary of Veterans Affairs and Undersecretary of Defense. He is also current visiting fellow with the Center for National Defense at the Heritage Foundation. Secretary Wilkie, thank you for making time to be with us tonight.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much. More than 100 democratic countries, as Jenna was just saying, are represented in today's Democracy Summit at the White House, notably absent China and Russia. What statement does their exclusion make?
Well, I hate to be negative when it comes to an event that supposedly promotes democracy, but I think this is performative performance art masquerading as diplomacy. Noticeably absent from this forum are dissidents from Hong Kong, dissidents from Russia, dissidents from China, Cuba, Venezuela. If you want to, and Iran, you want to make an impact on the world and say that, yes, we are here to promote the natural rights of all human beings, you have to take a step forward and actually challenge the regimes that are a threat to the world. This administration has shown no inclination to do that. And your lead-in about anti-Semitism is a case in point. The boycott, divestment, and sanction movement in this country, which has not been condemned, but also the coddling of the Ayatollahs in Iran at the expense of Israel, and also the Arab nations that have come together with Israel, not only to share economic resources, but to fight against a common enemy, a threat to the very existence of the peoples of that region. So this is a much more complicated issue, and it requires more than just a performance. It requires some actual concrete actions.
Secretary, what's the long game play here against authoritarian governments with, human rights abuses and corruption? What's the long play here?
Well, the long play should be that the United States is a bulwark against the march of the dictators. If you look at this new axis of evil, China, Russia, and Iran, these are nations that have brought back the concentration camps. In China, there are over 1 million people in concentration camps. Muslims and Christians, Catholics, Anglicans are being persecuted and killed every day in China, yet you don't hear a response to that. What the United States should do is two things. One, we have to be the moral exemplar. But two, we have to provide the nations of the world the tools with which to fight back against this tide that we are seeing in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe, in China, against Taiwan, but also the spread of dictatorships now in our own hemisphere. Nicaragua, there were no dissidents from Nicaragua at this democracy summit. So we have to promote those who have put their lives on the line to speak for their people.
Secretary Wilkie, the president met virtually this week with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Is that call going to be enough, in your thoughts, to stave off a possible Russian military invasion of Ukraine?
Well, let's look what Putin's doing. He's challenging this president on several fronts. He's weaponized migrants coming out of the Middle East and overwhelming the defenses of Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. He's moved into the Middle East. He just signed a defense cooperation agreement with Saudi Arabia. He just met with Prime Minister Bennett. Those are people who have felt that Biden has abandoned in the Middle East, and now he's playing games with Ukraine. As long as we keep begging Russia for fuel, for oil, to mitigate against the bad policies of this administration, nothing concrete will happen. We have to stand firm, and I'm sad to say I don't see this administration doing that.
All right, Secretary Wilkie, we appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for what you do.
Thank you so much. Well, some good news for the American economy tonight. Not only are jobless claims at the lowest level they've been since the beginning of the pandemic, they're at the lowest level they've been in more than 52 years. Labor Department numbers out today show 184,000 people applied for unemployment last week, down 43,000 from the week prior. That's a figure not seen since 1969. President Biden reacted to today's numbers, saying, "Thanks to the American Rescue Plan and our successful vaccination program, Americans are back at work at a record-setting pace." Though it was good news for unemployment, many companies are still having a hard time finding workers during what's been called the Great Resignation. This week, the Labor Department reported 11 million job openings and historical high turnover rates.
And joining us now, Mark Hamrick, Senior Economic Analyst and Washington Bureau Chief at Bankrate. Mark, welcome. Good to see you. So the U.S. Labor Department reporting jobless claims falling to its lowest point in more than 50 years. What do you make of these latest numbers?
It's a reminder that there's no rush on the part of employers or enterprises across the country to shed workers. And we can remember some difficult days in the economy, particularly during the great financial crisis, where there would be an end of year kind of bludgeoning of workers where people decided that was the time to lighten up on their workforces. So if anything, I think employers right now want to hold on to the workers they have with the fear that if they had an opening, they're not fully confident that they'll be able to fill it.
At the same time, Mark, Labor Department data from earlier this week shows 11 million jobs in the country going unfilled. The Biden administration is touting these jobless numbers. I want to ask you, Mark, how much of a win do you see this as?
Well, if you're wanting to have low unemployment, the path toward low unemployment is having a large number of jobs. The unemployment rate has moved within 1 percentage point of the previous low of 3.5%, most recently at 4.2% in November. And so the path toward better employment and lower unemployment is more jobs. We just need to have some better matching of the workers who are available with the available positions.
Yeah. America's biggest bank, kind of shifting gears here, JP Morgan, says 2022 will mark the end of the pandemic and a full economic recovery. That's coming from the bank's chief global markets strategist. That's a bold prediction. Mark, what do you think?
Well, I don't know that JP Morgan has employed anyone who's worked previously at the National Institutes of Health, so that is a bold prediction. But we have made substantial progress on getting people vaccinated. And I've said basically since the time when the pandemic began that the path toward healing of the economy is really paved with solutions with respect to addressing the pandemic. And I think we've seen that. More and more people getting vaccinated, the economy healing, more people feeling confident about venturing out into public. Eventually, that means more people getting onto airplanes or going across the country, and eventually, hopefully, having more people travel internationally, come to the United States, spend their well-earned dollars from abroad, and also get business travel restored. And so those latter two pieces are part of the puzzle that really is yet to come.
Mark, in the final minute that we have, I want to ask you about inflation. Do you think we'll see that balance out in 2022, or will it last indefinitely longer?
Well, clearly not indefinitely, because if it were to persist even longer than currently expected, the Federal Reserve has essentially that sledgehammer to begin raising interest rates and dampen demand. My own thought is that I think that the second half of next year will see better news on inflation, lower inflation. We'll definitely have better year-over-year comparisons. And again, getting the supply and demand imbalance better addressed and getting the supply chain disruptions addressed. And also, we're already seeing some declines in the costs of gasoline, crude oil, and commodities.
All right, Mark Hamrick with Bankrate. We always appreciate you spending time with us on Thursday. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John and Jenna.
The lawmakers pause to honor the life of an American hero, remembering Bob Dole when Faith Nation returns.
Welcome back. The nation began bidding farewell to former U.S. Senator Bob Dole today, the war hero and statesman lying in state in the Capitol Rotunda ahead of his funeral tomorrow.
Stirring tributes from President Biden and congressional leaders honored Dole's legacy in a touching ceremony. CBN's Brody Carter has more on the life and legacy of Bob Dole.
Great is thy faithfulness.
In his final ascent on the steps of Capitol Hill, Senator Robert J. Dole was transported in a military procession to the Capitol Rotunda.
My fellow Americans, America has lost one of our greatest patriots.
Political leaders from both sides of the aisle put aside differences to honor his dedication to this country.
He taught us over time and all the time to respect people for what they can do and not judge them for what they cannot.
He'd taken the fight to the Nazis, and he'd nearly paid for it with his life.
Bob Dole was born in 1923 in Russell, Kansas, a state Dole would serve more than 45 years in both chambers of Congress. Dole was a decorated World War II veteran and two-time Purple Heart recipient. Even though the war cost him the use of his right hand, Dole cherished serving his country.
Of all the titles I've had, I try to get one I didn't get, but the one I'm most proud of is the title of veteran.
Throughout his tenure, the former senator ran for president 3 times. President Bill Clinton presented his electoral rival with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and Dole talked presidential politics on the 700 Club with Pat Robertson.
Have you decided what you're going to do?
Oh, I'm out. It's a clear run for you, Bob. No problem.
That's right. This is your program, right?
Thursday's bittersweet farewell was reflective of a time Bob Dole stood from his wheelchair in the same room and mourned the loss of his dear friend and colleague, George H.W. Bush.
And how moved the whole nation was to see Senator Dole salute President Bush.
And we thank God, the source of all love, both for Bob's incredible journey here in this life and for the fact that he has entered his eternal reward in the next.
Lord, unto me.
Welcome back. More Americans now eligible for the Pfizer booster vaccine.
That's right, Jenna. The FDA today granted an emergency use authorization for 16 and 17-year-olds. The booster had already been approved for those 18 and up. Today's move comes as fears grow over the Omicron variant, and coronavirus cases are on the rise yet again. The United States now averages about 120,000 new cases every day. That's a 26% rise over the past 2 weeks. COVID deaths are 14%. The virus is killing about 1,300 people daily.
If you look at the top 5 states for COVID deaths right now, they're generally hovering around only a 50% vaccination rate. I certainly expect that we're going to see some substantial differences in the size of holiday surges here this winter based around kind of proportion of patients who are vaccinated.
According to the CDC, about 40% of Americans are still unvaccinated. 30% of those are adults.
Still ahead, first responders to the rescue. Florida firefighters get creative to free a trapped child. Finally tonight, a Florida boy was recently stuck between a rock and a hard place after getting his foot stuck in a concrete sewer pipe.
Though the pipe was above ground, the South Trail Fire Department had to get creative and bring in extra resources. The firefighters tried everything: water, removing the boy's shoe, greasing the kid up, and more, leaving them with only one thing left to try. After fitting the boy with earmuffs and goggles, the first responders removed the concrete piece by piece, freeing the boy with no more than a scratch on his knee. Those guys are critically important as first responders.
Gosh, grateful for those heroes. Oh my goodness.
Well, thanks for watching Faith Nation.
Have a great night.